Welcome to this video in which I'm looking again at the Philip Marlowe series on to book 2. The book is called Farewell My Lovely, and instead of doing like a typical review that I would normally do, I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to do a countdown of my top 10 favourite one-liners from the book. Number 10, which is, as phony as the pedigree of a used car. Even some 70 or 80 years later, this line still has that ring of truth, of relatability to it, so I rather like to have included it on this list. Number 9, Marlowe is investigating the murder at a bar called Florian's, and he goes and finds the widow of the previous owner, and he describes her as cute as a wash tub. Number 8, he goes to visit a detective, and he describes in quite some detail the ramshackle nature of the detective's office, the scruffiness of his clothing, and then observes that he certainly looked poor enough to be honest. One of the themes of the book, the rich tend to be rich enough to get away with the things that they're up to, whereas the poor have to take and deal with the consequences. One of those consequences is the rich, like Hollywood hypnotists who are successful enough to have their own bodyguards, also occasionally meet with people like Marlowe in the course of his investigations. And Marlowe describes one of that hypnotist's bodyguards as, he was a wind-blown blossom of some 200 pounds with freckled teeth and the mellow voice of a circus barker. And in the same scene, Marlowe also meets a policeman operating outside of his jurisdiction, perhaps a crooked cop, but certainly not one known for his intellect, because as Marlowe observes, I could see him thinking. It hurt his corns. But if Mrs Florian does nothing for Marlowe's libido, then there's the blonde, the rich blonde who is the cause of all the trouble. And what story featuring Marlowe would be complete without a blonde that could give him a smile he feels in his hip pocket? But we're back to Mrs Florian and our first meeting for number 4. Mrs Florian is an alcoholic. She's scruffy, her house is run down, she's basically in the throes of drinking herself to death when they first meet, and Marlowe describes her voice as the voice dragged itself out of her throat like a sick man getting out of bed. Such a wonderful simile that I had to include it on my list. Perhaps it might have been a bit lower on yours, but I do love a good simile, and I thought that was quite spectacular. So we're into the final 3, but before we finish our countdown, I'm just going to do some also-rans or some bubbling unders depending on which country that you're from, and I'm going to start with one that's not even by Marlowe himself. Marlowe is investigating the murder at a bar, and one of the witnesses says to him, "A nice quiet place, Sam Run too. Ain't nobody been knifed there in a month." Certainly sounds like the sort of place that could do with Patrick Swayze's intervention. The next one, Marlowe goes to the dead man's house. The phone rings and he picks it up, and the person asks for the dead man naturally, and Marlowe says he's unavailable, to which the voice on the phone says, "He's not sick, is he?" And Marlowe replies, "Well, he's not up and around." And we move back to our blonde. Of course, every story needs one, and every story needs a rich one, preferably, and this is no exception. When Marlowe pulls up outside her house for the meeting, he describes the lavish nature of the grounds and then turns his eye on the house. It was smaller than Buckingham Palace, rather grey for California, and probably had fewer windows than the Chrysler Building. Yeah, it sounds a bit like my place then. However, he's not quite finished then. He goes inside and appraises the antiques that make up his decor, and then he says that a rug is as old as Aesop's aunt. Let's move into the top 3 with... We're back to our famous blonde again, and this one is described as a blonde to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window. But perhaps the description of that coloured glass suggests there is more there than meets the eye. For number 2, Marlowe meets Moose Malloy, an ex-con, on the day he's released from prison, and he is dressed in a way he believes will attract back his former love. However, it is rather ostentatious, incredibly colourful and bright and gaudy, and Marlowe observes that he looked about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food. And our last one, our champion one-liner. In this scene, Marlowe walks into the manager's office and discovers 2 things. First is that the manager has his hand on a gun that he's in the process of pulling out of a drawer, and the second is that his head has been snapped clean over the back of his chair. Marlowe looks at the gun and observes that the man was in the process of drawing it, and he says, "It had probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but the position of Mr. Montgomery's head proved that the idea had been wrong." which rather sums up the really black, dark, the dry, wry humour that is the bedrock, if you like, of all of the Marlowe stories. And if you've liked this one or any of the others on this list, then this may well be a series that you will enjoy. Bear in mind that some of the attitudes and language are very much a product of the time, which was the 1940s. Take that as a recommendation if you wish. Typically you would find on this channel a book review or something very similar. So if that sounds like something you might enjoy, then like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.